Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar on behaviour support and restrictive practices. And I apologise for being slightly late in commencing. My name is Janet Anderson. I am the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting right the way around Australia, wherever you are watching this, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for today's webinar. Today, we're very keen to talk with you about behaviour support and restrictive practice, as I said, and to clarify some of the myths that seem to be circulating in the sector about this important aspect of care. One of the myths relates to informed consent and the ins and outs of obtaining and recording that consent. Another myth or misunderstanding is that it is breaking the rules to use any form of restrictive practice, and that is simply not true. And we're going to spend some time unpacking that myth and ensuring that you have a really good understanding about the rules that relate to the use of restrictive practices. We're very aware that there have been changes in providers' legal obligations in relation to both behaviour support planning and use of behaviour support practices, and also restrictive practices, and that they may have led to some confusion or possibly even misunderstanding about what's allowed or not allowed. And so today, we're making it our mission to start a conversation with you in the sector and to unravel some of these complex areas so that you can go forward more confident in your practices in relation to the care you're delivering for older Australians. Now, from the outset, I want to highlight the point that the Aged Care Act does not ban restrictive practices. The Act, which is our legislative framework, of course, recognises that in certain circumstances, using restrictive practice can benefit an older person's quality of life and is sometimes a necessary aspect of care. However, equally importantly, any time that a restrictive practice is used, it must be in strict accordance with the legal obligations set out in the Act, in the Quality of Care Principles. So if you're an aged care provider or a worker, we expect you to be very familiar with these obligations. And I'll just recite them now, but I know Melanie and others will talk about them during the webinar. Restrictive practice can only be used as a last resort after behaviour support options have been tried and failed. It must be the least restrictive alternative, used for the minimum period of time with adequate oversight and subject to regular review. Now, these legal rules and obligations are underpinned by a recognition and respect for every individual's human rights, including the right not to have unreasonable or unnecessary restrictions placed on their ability to move around freely. So, just for clarification, an individual's human rights are not extinguished just because they're receiving aged care or because they have a cognitive impairment. And that's recognised in the Aged Care Charter of Rights and also seen throughout the quality standards. So in this webinar, the ground we're going to cover is we're going to talk about 4 of the 5 types of restrictive practices. So we're going to cover environmental, physical, mechanical, and seclusion. And we're also going to unpack and bust some of the myths and misconceptions that we see in practice. The 5th type of restrictive practice, which is chemical restraint, will be the subject of a subsequent webinar. So joining me on the panel today are experts in this area, Dr. Melanie Roth, who's the Commission's Chief Clinical Advisor, Lauren de Vries, who is a nurse practitioner and the Senior Practitioner, Behaviour Support, and Megan Cox, who's a registered nurse and the Director of the Restrictive Practices Unit. A bit of housekeeping before we start. During the webinar, there will be a Q&A session once we've gone through some of the panelists' information. So if you haven't already submitted questions, or if you have further questions as a result of what we discuss, use the live Q&A tab, which will be visible on your screen, to submit additional questions. And we'll get to as many of them as we can in the time we have available. At the end of the webinar, there is a short survey which we would be very pleased if you would complete. It gives you an opportunity to provide us with feedback on how you found the webinar, but you can also use it to nominate topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars. And finally, we will be recording this session and it will be available on our website for those of you who want to watch it again or recommend it to colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Lauren de Vries, our senior practitioner, to start off proceedings. Thanks, Lauren.
So we at the Commission definitely see and hear a wide range of different views and understandings about behaviour support and restrictive practices. We know from talking to providers that they are aware of the legislative requirements, the definitions and the quality of care principles. However, we do see that sometimes providers don't understand how to implement those requirements and don't understand what their practical implications might be. So this is where we thought about some of those myths and misconceptions that Janet has previously referred to. We commonly hear these throughout the Commission, and particularly if we're going and engaging with providers. And this means that providers might not be doing things that are required or that are not best practice. And this potentially can impact on the care and the rights of consumers. To start off with, I wanted to explain who we are in the Restrictive Practices Unit and who I am. So I am the Senior Practitioner for Behaviour Support, and I support the Restrictive Practices team here at the Commission. The Director of the Restrictive Practices Unit is Megan Cox, who will also be presenting today. Our primary responsibility is to provide clinical expertise and advice on behaviour support and restrictive practice. This is internally to some of our regulatory teams. So that might be the quality assessors, the complaints officers, compliance officers, or we have involvement in the serious incident notifications as well. We also have responsibility for supporting providers to understand their regulatory obligations regarding the use of restrictive practices and to support best practice person-centred behaviour support as a preferred alternative. We work in the clinical area here at the Commission, which is led by Dr. Melanie Roth, the Chief Clinical Advisor. And as part of that team, we also have a clinical unit, a food, nutrition and dining unit, and a clinical pharmacy unit as well. So these units are seen and used as subject matter experts here within the Commission. To start today's discussion, we are going to look at restrictive practice in a way that might make your discussions and your decisions and processes easier. And to do that, I'm going to hand over to Melanie.
Thanks very much. So I want to go to sort of the background issue in relation to thinking about restrictive practices. When we're going to infringe or impact on a person's rights, great care has to be taken that the process is both legitimate and clear. Obviously, we can't just lock people up without a very good reason and a legitimate defensible process. Now, this applies throughout society in such situations as putting people in jail, holding them in youth detention, refugee facilities, police lockups, and it also applies to aged care. You can't just tie people up or hold them down or hold them back or confine them into a chair or bed or keep them solitary away from other humans without a really good reason and process. This is, of course, how we want things for ourselves. And I'm going to talk about me, and I'm sure you can relate to it. But if and when I'm in aged care and in some way I am at great risk, I would like someone to put in measures to protect me or protect others that I might cause harm to. However, not while I'm still able to make these decisions myself, not if the risks are not high, and not if the correct process hasn't been gone through. So the risks that people take in their own lives to gamble, to speculate, to ride a motorbike, to walk by a canal, to form relationships, or not to have a shower, all need to be taken into account that these are the things we may have done lifelong and may want to continue to do. And if you're going to interfere with that, I want there to be a proper assessment for me. What is the risk? How severe and how likely is it? How can the risk be managed differently? How can I be supported? How will you make sure I'm harmed as little as possible by what you do in your attempt to protect me in some way? Who will check on me? And what will you do if it isn't helping or it's causing me great harm or distress? So that really takes us to ask what the issue is. A person might try or want to do something that the provider doesn't think they should do. For example, walk around in the community, walk around in the service, get out of bed at night, have certain relationships or interactions with others. Alternatively, the provider might want to do something to a person that they feel they should do that the person doesn't like or doesn't want. For example, shower them, attend to their dressings, change their continence aids. They might want to sit in a particular place or smoke. So aged care restrictive practices can only be used or considered when there is a clear risk of harm to self or others. So this needs to be properly assessed and articulated. You've got to start with the individual person and their individual risk. And so that really means you've got to identify the right person to do this assessment. And Megan's going to talk a little bit more about that later. However, you can't just say you're doing something for safety. If you're doing it for safety, it means there's a risk that you're trying to address, and you need to say what that risk is, clearly identify it for that individual. And the same applies to using the term duty of care. The actual risk considered for this individual at this point in time and in this particular situation. So the risk in my service here might be very different if I move to a service that's not in my own environment or is in some other risky location. You need to document and evidence that risk. Be clear what the risk might be. Has it actually happened? Have you got evidence of previous harms or actions? What makes you think this person might behave or act in a way that is so risky? What underlying conditions might contribute to it, and who have you consulted about these? And there may, of course, be assessments that have been conducted before the person came into your service. The risks in the particular community and location that you're in. It's really important you can't assume that because somebody's got dementia or another disability that there's automatically a risk. Many people living with dementia have many retained abilities. There are other conditions where somebody might be at risk where this might change. So a person might regain capacity, function and ability to operate their lives safely enough, for example, after stroke, after an episode of delirium, and if you've deprescribed a medication that was interfering with their thinking. So the assessment is underpinned by the diagnosis and by its manifestation in an individual at this point in time, and of course it may then need reassessment. But in identifying the risk, you've got to ask how severe the risk actually is, how the risk might be reduced or mitigated, commence discussions at this early point with the person and their decision maker because they need to be involved in the whole process. You might need to, at this point, trigger a behavioural assessment documentation and indeed develop a behaviour support plan. But you need to document the reason why you're intending to act on this risk with the use of restrictive practices. So as an example, for environmental restraint, for example, somebody's in a secure unit or complex, this confining them to it can only be used if there is a risk. For example, the person may be clearly unable to maintain road safety. They may come to misadventure in bushland or near water, be unable to understand weather extremes. They may become exploited, get lost, be assaulted, spend, exhibit sexually or disinhibited behaviour, and they may be at risk of doing harm to others. So what you're asking is what behaviour might occur in the community without this environmental restraint, and can this be managed without restraint with behaviour support and other strategies such as monitoring or supports. Somebody confined in a princess chair because they might fall. why do you think there's a risk of falling? What is the actual risk? Have they fallen? And how else has this risk been addressed, such as lighting, rails, medication review, hydration, education, working on their balance and strength, or providing opportunities for regular supervised walking and toileting. And sometimes this risk assessment, as you can see, can lead to a provider change what they do rather than use a restrictive practice. Another example is staff will need to hold this person down to shower them. What is the risk? The risk is that they'll refuse to come into the shower. And when you hold them down, there's obviously a risk that they will get upset about this, and that may be seen as the person having aggressive behaviour. But why are we insisting and holding them? Do they actually have to be showered? What's going on for the person? Why don't they like a shower? How can it be done differently, or by a different person? Or what the risk of the restricted practice, as in holding someone down, you may find is much greater than the risk that it's trying to address, which may be that they're smelly. So again, all along, the decision maker needs to be involved in this. Moving on to impact, looking at the risk of the use of restrictive practice in this person. So you've got to weigh the risks of the impacts of the various options open to you, if there are options. And in order to understand what the impacts are, you really need to think about it actively. So this can guide the rationale for which choice of restrictive practice you use, and for you to be able to say why it's least restrictive. All restrictive practices have potential risks of use or impacts on the person, but these will be different for each person. So we need to understand the potential risks or impacts of whatever restrictive practice you're proposing. Impact can be observable or not. It can be severe or mild, and crucially, it can change. So you need to understand and predict for each person what the possible impacts are, and that will help you guide minimising strategies, so where you have to use them as little as possible, and how to monitor them, because when you're monitoring something, you're monitoring the impact. So impact can be physical, something obvious, such as abrasion, injury, at risk of suffocation, bruising. It can be delayed, such as chafing, weight loss, deconditioning, or it can be hidden, such as pain, cold, full bladder not being emptied, being wet. It can also be psychological, where there can be a great fear, misery, depression, anxiety, hopelessness, agitation, anger, loss of trust, or boredom. That can all occur because a restrictive practice has been used. And of course, it can be social, where the person loses their opportunities for interaction and to have a sense of inclusion and community. And there are other things such as spiritual and loss of dignity, etc. So the potential for restrictive practice use to cause distress to the person needs to be recognised, and the impact itself and the distress can very much be related on the impact on their rights to autonomy, choice, freedom of movement, risk-taking, to make bad decisions, and access to everything that all of the rest of us currently have access to. And I just want to give you an example of a person where the provider didn't realise there was an impact of the person being in a secure environment. He knew he couldn't leave, so he wasn't trying to, but he didn't want to be there. And what he said to his family was, "I want to be at home and the garden needs water. I know they're keeping me here, so I must have done something wrong, but I don't know what it is that I've done. Either that or they've got the wrong bloke." Now that's a really heartbreaking, true example of an impact of a restrictive practice that wasn't recognised. And when it was recognised, the ongoing reassurance and explanation and reminding was able to address that. Another unrecognised impact is when bed rails are used, again, allegedly for safety. You need to go back and identify what the actual risk is. But people may lose the ability to call for help. They may forget to use a buzzer. They may lose it. They may suddenly be unable to do things independently that they previously were. They may get caught. They may thrash around and bang on things. They may try to climb over the bed rails, and in fact the bed rails therefore are greater risk than the risk they were addressing. And of course, somebody that's confined anywhere will very quickly decondition and lose function. Impacts of medications are numerous and profound, and we're going to address that at the next webinar. So what I want to do now is move on to monitoring, because once you've identified the impact and the rationale for the use of a restrictive practice, the monitoring follows on much more clearly and logically. So you're monitoring both for good and for harm. So when you're using a restrictive practice, you're expecting it to have a benefit in some way. So is it having the hoped for effect? Is the bed rail actually preventing the person from getting up and falling? Are there harms apparent? Are the harms you predicted? Are they worse than you thought? Or are there new harms that you hadn't even thought about? But if you know there are possibly going to be harms, you just need to identify when they're happening. And then finally, does one outweigh the other? If the harms are outweighing the benefits, then the whole process, you can see, needs reconsidering. So the monitoring needs to consider the possible and likely impacts on the individual and monitor specifically for these. And staff may need guidance as to how to monitor for all of the different impacts that potentially might occur. And so also you need to identify who will monitor and how. What will they look for, and what and where will they record? So then we can go on to review. And this plan obviously needs to be planned, but it needs to be deliberate and flexible, and it needs to be recorded. So you might want to identify a change of condition that might trigger a review. Somebody might be having a restrictive practice that is consented to by somebody saying, well, I'm not sure about it, let's give it a try and we'll review it in 2 weeks. Well, the time frame's then based on the consent. If there is a problem in terms of impact that is severe or unacceptable or unexpected, then maybe that should trigger a review. And if there's a lack of effectiveness, if the restrictive practice isn't actually addressing the risk satisfactorily. Now, progression of dementia may make the need for and benefits of a restrictive practice change. For example, a secure unit or locked area or service may be no longer required, or maybe it is now required. Recovery of abilities and cognition may occur. And static situations with low impact risks associated may not need frequent review, but rapidly changing or high distress situations may need frequent review, and indeed expert advice included in the assessment and review. And I can give an example of it was actually a deprescribing situation where a provider was deprescribing somebody who had been presented to them as frequently getting lost in the community and becoming agitated. So they deprescribed until there was no more prescribing. And the crux of it is that the person woke up really and started conversing and said, well, actually, I think I want to go home now, back to my old self. The service reassessed him and they agreed. He actually could care for himself and wanted to go home, and they started to get that process going. The tragedy was that the wife had transferred the property into her name and sold it, but it just went to show how the provider being willing to review what was happening actually led to a completely different outcome for an individual. So, of course, this all needs to be recorded. The whole process needs to be recorded. It's active. It needs to be added to. And the consultation and conversation at each step with the person, so you know their wishes and they can contribute to the assessment of impact, but also the person giving consent, the decision maker. If they're involved at all steps of the process, then the information component and their contribution to the solutions is much easier to record and document, and it's much clearer. I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that interesting perspective. Hopefully that's just given everybody a little bit more to think about. So we're going to go back to those 4 types of restrictive practice. And as Janet has already said, that we're not covering chemical restraint today. That will be for the upcoming webinar. So we're going to start by looking at environmental restraint, and I'm sure that you all know the definition of what environmental restraint is, but we're going to provide some of the myths that we have commonly heard here when we've been engaging with providers. So we can see that we often hear that only consumers that have exit-seeking behaviours or are trying to exit are subject to environmental restraint. However, that is a myth. What we need to do is consider that it's not about the type of behaviour that an individual demonstrates or displays. Rather, it's about does the consumer have free access to the environment or the community, which is their right. If we think about that lack of access, we also need to start then to think about the risks that we're trying to stop and what behaviour are we trying to sort of support as well. And I think that Melanie's been able to describe that quite well in previous discussion. So another myth that we heard is if a consumer is being locked, is behind a locked door for security or safety, this is not a restrictive practice or an environmental restraint. And again, while safety and security are very legitimate and reasonable reasons for securing or having a locked door, because obviously we want the facility to be safe and secure, it does not stop the impact of that locked door on the individual consumer. And it is something that needs to be considered. There needs to be that assessment of risk and then also the assessment of impact on that individual as well. So it really is based on that individual assessment, and we often see that that's missing sometimes when we review or have discussions with providers. So we can see if the front door is locked but the consumer has free access to gardens, this is not environmental restraint. And again, this is a myth. If the front door is locked, that means that that individual consumer may potentially not have free access to the community, and that might mean that they might want to go down to get a coffee, something like that, and that needs to be considered as a restrictive practice. And the other thing that we commonly hear is certain devices, but for environmental restraint, we do hear that barn doors have been banned by the Commission. And again, the Commission doesn't ban particularly parts of the environment. So it's very important to consider what the impact of that barn door might be. And for some individual consumers, that's a very useful thing to have in the environment to support that individual's care. So I think it's important to think about environmental restraint. We get a lot of questions about environmental restraint. Think about the environment and how it impacts on that free movement of an individual and how that impacts that individual. The next restrictive practice we're going to look at is physical restraint, and the definition is there. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the definition. We do commonly see that care staff are sometimes unsure about what restrictive practice physical restraint is and what that actually means for a consumer. So it is important that staff are educated and there is oversight about what happens, particularly behind closed doors and on weekends. That's when we might have an increase in reporting of a physical restraint being used when it has not been able to be used. So I think it's important to ensure that there's that oversight and that governance on what staff are doing for physical restraint. So some of the myths that we hear is holding a consumer's hand while attending to personal care is not considered physical restraint. However, that holding of an individual's hands or arms, if that's stopping that free movement, then potentially that is a physical restraint. And that's something that Melanie alluded to as well before. And it might be for provision of care or provision of continence care, and that's where we need to have a look at the risk and what we're trying to support and how we're trying to support that consumer. And the other myth that we hear is that as long as the consumer is not harmed, then it's not considered physical restraint. And again, this is a myth. This is something we might not be able to know what the impact is for that consumer, but it is impacting on the individual's rights, and that also needs to be part of that consideration as well. We then have mechanical restraint, and again, the definition is up there in terms of mechanical restraint. So there are quite a few myths that we hear in regards to mechanical restraint. We hear that certain devices are restraint. So, for example, all bed rails are considered mechanical restraints, or all low beds are considered mechanical restraints. However, we need to consider that it's not actually about the device, it's about how the device is used and the assessment of the individual consumer. So how is it being used and the impact of that device on that individual and their movement, free movement, for example. And we hear that quite commonly. For example, bed rails are banned by the Commission and cannot be used. However, again, we don't ban certain devices. Sometimes bed rails are absolutely beneficial to someone's quality of life and can have a positive impact on someone's quality of life. So it's about how is the device being used and the impact of that device on the consumer. And we've heard this similar sort of theme, such as dignity suits are not a restrictive practice as they are for dignity. So as you can see, they are titled, dignity suits. However, we know that the impact of a dignity suit being worn is that the consumer potentially, it's stopping a consumer having free movement, and that free movement is being able to touch certain parts of their body. So therefore, even though it might be for the individual's dignity, we still need to consider that potentially as a restrictive practice. So there's just some little pointers to think about and some of the myths that we hear. I'm going to hand over to Megan, and she's going to talk about seclusion.
Thanks, Lauren. So now we're going to talk about seclusion. It's important to be aware that this is a more extreme form of restrictive practice. So it's important to have a clear understanding of what actually constitutes seclusion, and also ensure that there's adequate oversight of all decisions about possible seclusion and its practices within your services. Some important considerations in this space is what is the purpose, understanding the purpose of the intervention, and also consider the impact. This can relate to punishment versus privacy in these situations as well. Another consideration is, can the consumer leave, or do they think that they can't leave, as this could be perceived as a threat or an actual order with that individual consumer. So therefore, it's really important that we consider the individual consumer's perspective. And an example of this is that because they may feel that they're not actually able to leave their room because something bad might happen to them, and this could be considered a threat. Another example and a common myth that we're also seeing is not recognising the inadvertent use, especially if used due to behaviour of others. And we often see this occur where a consumer is experiencing a changed behaviour that actually requires support, or where that behaviour is impacting other consumers in that area. And as a result, in that situation, the individual consumer experiencing the behaviour may be redirected to their room, or other consumers in that area are being redirected. And this could be considered seclusion. We see other myths where, and this relates to taking the consumer to a lounge area if they're noisy or agitated, not being seclusion, and not recognising the impact of this intervention. A practical way of thinking involves providers actually understanding the requirements and also seeking to understand and assess the effect of any intervention on the individual consumer. And this can also assist in determining whether it's a restrictive practice or not. So we've just gone over an overview of some of those myths and misunderstandings that we come across around restrictive practices. So now we're going to move on to who needs to be involved in the decision to have a restrictive practice. And this is something that comes up quite a lot. We usually hear also from general practitioners, and sometimes this can be due to the frustration about them being asked to sign specific forms. It's really important as aged care providers that you understand the requirements you need to fulfil around the use of restrictive practices. And this slide is a really helpful slide in being able to determine who needs to be involved in assessing the need for a restrictive practice. So as you can see on this slide, the only type of restrictive practice that requires a general practitioner or nurse practitioner involved in the assessment is chemical restraint. That's because a medication actually affects a person's behaviour, and the prescribing of that medication is by a relevant health practitioner with those clinical qualifications, and that can be the general practitioner or nurse practitioner. For the other types of restrictive practices, what you can see on this slide is that it refers to an approved health practitioner, and the legislation defines an approved health practitioner as a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner, or registered nurse. And what's important to note for the other types of restrictive practices that we've referred to today is that that registered nurse can undertake that assessment and the need for the restrictive practice. It's also important to recognise that your registered nurses will more likely have that understanding and day-to-day knowledge of the individual consumer to make that holistic assessment in regards to the use of the restrictive practice. Of course, we're very aware, and it's really important to consider when other practitioners need to be involved in these assessments, and taking a team approach to addressing the issues, particularly when referring to restrictive practices. And these health practitioners can also be really helpful and resourceful in suggesting specific behaviour support strategies, and also assisting in assessing an individual consumer's capacity to make decisions, and also the consideration around risk. So in this situation, you may find that other health practitioners are involved, but recognising who is the right person to make that assessment in regards to the use of restrictive practice. We're now going to move on and going to talk about one of probably the most prevalent myths or misunderstandings that our team is seeing within the Commission. And it's in relation to what valid informed consent actually looks like. And currently we're seeing that providers are of the perspective that it is through a form or a signature on a form. So what we're finding is that with these forms, that it's not actually supported by evidence to demonstrate that a valid informed consent process has actually occurred. It is really essential that providers have systems and processes in place to ensure that the individual who is authorised to provide that consent or give that consent is provided as much information as possible so that they can actually come to an informed decision. This also includes understanding the alternatives, the risks, and what is actually hoped for the benefit for the individual regarding the use of the restrictive practice. So looking at this example, you can see that this actually is not demonstrating a proper consent process. It's not outlining that specific information about what was discussed with the relevant person, and making sure that you're speaking to the right person who can give that consent through explaining those individual risks, and recognising that individual risks is based on the consumer and their circumstances, and those risks can vary. So that's why an individual conversation is really essential for an informed consent process. The rationale for the use of the restrictive practice, and that assessment and conversation is clearly documented. It doesn't need to be through a form with the GP, and that form does not necessarily demonstrate that valid informed consent has been obtained. So also consider about your own systems and processes within the organisation. Who makes this assessment, the skills and education and understanding of the individual consumer to undertake a valid informed consent process? So we hope that today's webinar has helped to clarify some common misunderstandings about restrictive practices, and that we will be able to share these learnings with your teams. On this slide, you'll see that there's some helpful resources, and you'll also be able to check out the additional information available on the Commission's website. And we will also invite you to join us for the second webinar in this series, which will be advertised shortly. I'll now hand back to Janet.
All right. Well done, Megan, and thank you very much to you, Lauren and Melanie. There's a lot of content that you have very successfully communicated in the information that you've provided. And it's great to see that we've also been receiving some questions, and I'm very pleased to take some time now to address some of those. We also had some which were pre-submitted, and I'm going to go to one of those first. Melanie, the first one for you, if I can. Is it considered physical restraint if 3 or 4 staff hold a resident to assist in providing care such as dressing a wound or changing a continence aid?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer is that physical restraint when somebody is being held still or held in place, whatever the reason for, if it's preventing them from doing something they want to do, get you away, for example, then this is clearly falls within the definition of physical restraint. So this doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. However, there still needs to be the full assessment, consideration of the risks being addressed. Why do you need to hold this person down? What is the risk to them if you don't? And the proposed benefits that ensue. So you're trying to do something to a person they don't want, and this can cause huge distress. Imagine being held down day after day for an aspect of care that you don't want for some reason. It can cause huge distress, fear, loss of trust, and often it involves pain as well. And of course, that's why the person may well be hitting out or trying to stop you holding them and performing their care, which then it's that there's a risk that that's going to be framed as the person being aggressive rather than the person not wanting you to do. So really you need to go to, why is the person refusing or not wanting it? Is it because they don't understand? How can that be improved? Is it because they know that it's going to be painful? Is it that the shower's going to be cold, or that they don't want to be naked in front of people? Is it that they want to do it themselves? Could it be managed with a nicer person? Can they do aspects of self-care? So, giving them the washer rather than you holding them down to wash. And if it's a wound dressing or something, do they need analgesia prior to it? And a clear explanation and kindness rather than the force of holding someone down.
Oh, very comprehensive answer. Vanessa has come in with a really, really important question that I know others would have in their minds as well. It goes like this. If a resident is directed away from co-residents to a different area of the facility, but they're still able to wander freely, and they're redirected to this other area because they are pushing co-residents out of their way or removing their items, then the question that Vanessa puts is, whose rights take precedence? Now, I don't think we would come at this from the perspective of respective rights, but I'm assuming you're going to talk to us again about assessment of risk and response to the impact of a restrictive practice. But over to you.
Yes, correct. So the risk, what is the risk? And presumably somebody is assessing that they are causing a risk of some harm to somebody else. And the first thing then, when you've identified that risk, is how can that risk be managed? One of the options you've identified is directing them to another area, and there may be many other options. So the rights of everyone need to be balanced. So the rights of people to be safe and not feel threatened in their service is absolutely a really, really important right. And I myself wouldn't want to think that I was causing other people to feel unsafe. Yes, and then of course there is the right of the person to walk freely, that if that is posing a risk to self and others, you've identified the risk, hopefully you've quantified it, hopefully you've tried to manage it, and if they're not going to be able to go back to that area of the service, how can you make their life in the area they are allowed to be in good?
Okay, yes, really important point on which to end. Thank you. Lauren, one for you. The use of pillows, pool noodles, concave mattresses, are they considered a restrictive practice?
The answer is it depends, and we often say that here within the restrictive practices unit, because again, it's not up to the device or whether it's a pillow or the concave mattress. It's actually how does that device impact somebody's movement. So what is the impact on that individual? Does it stop or prevent them getting out of bed? Is it just stopping moving a part of their body in the bed? Are they normally mobile or normally immobile? So there's several things that need to be considered and weighed up, and that also goes around good assessment. So that good assessment to see how the impact has been assessed, the benefit of that device being used, and then that all needs to be documented, which we sometimes see missing, that lack of documentation. Often the assessment might have occurred, but we just don't see that documented. So that's very, very important to have that thorough documentation. So that means that it doesn't mean that pillow or concave mattress shouldn't be used. What we're saying is the assessment needs to be done and working out if it is a restrictive practice or not, and then looking at how that's going to benefit the individual consumer. And of course, it needs to be the last resort for the least amount of time as well.
Okay. All right, Megan, one for you. The questions come in. Can you provide some clarity about the situation where an older person is not given access to particular items they might want? Now, we can define items in whatever way suits the question, but the question is, again, is that a restrictive practice if they're denied access to those items?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. So in response, I guess this is one of the key questions of it depends, and we go back to individual assessment, understanding the effect on the individual consumer, the purpose, and what is the intended outcome as well. In this situation, what we'd need to understand is what the item actually is and why they're being denied access to that specific item. For example, if it's a walking aid or similar, then that could be a restrictive practice if they're being restricted from accessing that walking aid. But if it's something that they would not normally have access to, such as the cleaner's cupboard or an industrial kitchen, this is not a restrictive practice. Another practical example that I'll provide is a consumer's access to their personal items, and that may include an iPad, a phone, cigarettes. In this situation, great care needs to be taken because although it may not always fall into the definition of a restrictive practice, it could actually be restricting the individual's rights of access to their own property in that situation. So what is really important from a provider is to ensure that there's a very clear rationale that to be articulated for doing this and that the action's taken, and also be aware that from the person's perspective that this could be seen as theft from their point of view.
Okay, all right. I'm going to interrupt proceedings just briefly for a process check. Because we were a bit late starting, I would like to run a bit over time, so I hope that's not going to inconvenience people who are watching, but you're putting in some really good questions and I don't want to shortchange you. So we will be running a little longer than scheduled in order to get to as many questions as possible. Let me go back to, I think, Lauren, I'm going to ask this one of you, and I know it's a question we get a lot. It's about secure units. So the question is, how can we, the providers and workers, minimise the impact of that perimeter security type of restrictive practice?
Thank you so much. And I really like that question because it's actually the provider is thinking about the impact of that environmental restraint, which is great. So at times, absolutely, environmental restraint is necessary. The perimeter restraint is sometimes can be considered the least restrictive because they've got the free access. Consumers can move around the whole building freely. But I guess the number one thing to consider is that the least restrictive for that individual? And that's, again, goes back to assessment and goes back to assessing the risk for that individual consumer. If that is deemed to be the least restrictive, then it's really about making sure that within that environmental restraint, that individual consumer has got individualised, person-centred care, and that they've got a good life. They're able to do the things that they would normally want to do. The other thing that a provider might want to consider is being able to give that individual access to the community on certain times, or working with the individual's loved one in being able to freely take them out or do the things that they previously perhaps used to do, whether that's go down for coffee or, you know, go to the local club, whatever that might be. So it's addressing the need, making sure it's the least restrictive, and then making sure that individual has got a good life whilst they're, you know, whilst the staff are using that environmental restraint to support that individual.
Oh, good answer. Thank you. That's very clear. Melanie, I've got one for you, and that Michelle has asked, and I know it's another frequently raised issue with us, and that's where there's a difference of opinion or preference between a family member and the older person receiving care. So Michelle's question is, what happens in the circumstance where families insist that their loved one is showered every day, even when that individual is adamant that they would prefer it be done less frequently? What's your answer to that?
My answer is that it's difficult. Providers do very much want to work with families, and families are usually, but not always, a very good advocate, and usually really genuinely have the person's best interests at heart. There is, however, a limit in what families can insist upon, and there's a limit to when they can and can't consent to something. They certainly can't insist in most cases that a provider does something that a provider's got good reason not to want to do. And the preferred course of action obviously is negotiation. So first of all, really clarifying with the family member where your responsibilities lie. Your first responsibility is obviously to the person, and that their wishes have to be taken into account as a very high priority, and that you are looking at other people in the service and what the impacts of various activities might be on them, and that where there's a dispute among family members, there may be a middle ground, a negotiation, but often the way forward is by everyone understanding what you're trying to say, what you're trying to do, and understanding the impact on the person, because often they will modify their demands if they actually understand the possible impacts of their demands. And the bed rails is a typical thing where they want bed rails, and they absolutely, until you explain what the risks of bed rails are, they're unable to see any negative at all. So it's really just conversation highlighting the risks and benefits, your perspective, your responsibilities, and in the end, you may have to not do what a family member wants. Yes, and I absolutely appreciate it's difficult. It's a difficult way to tread through.
Okay.
There's also, Janet, OPAN may have a role in this situation as well. So you can invoke other people to help with the conversation, OPAN and other health experts.
Yes, people advocating on behalf of those receiving care are often valued players in these sort of discussions. I'm going to come to Megan. I just lost the question. Here it is. Sarah's asked, is it physical restraint when a person's hand is being held for reassurance with no force when the person experiences anxiety?
Yeah, so in that situation, it sounds like it's using a gentle approach to engage with the resident. So there's the circumstances when it's not considered physical restraint. So in that situation, it sounds like the staff member is not using physical force to subdue or restrict the individual consumer's movement. So it's about also understanding and recognising the individual consumer's needs. Is that gentle touch actually going to support them and de-escalate their behaviours, or is it going to escalate their behaviour in that situation? So that's where it's really important to actually understand what's the purpose of that intervention. Is it actually achieving its desired effect, and looking at if it is an appropriate strategy for that individual consumer and the impact of that.
Okay, good. Lauren, this might be our last question. A timeout strategy. So if an individual, and I'm paraphrasing the question that's been put, but if an individual is demonstrating an increasing degree of tension and unease, and you know that when they are stimulated in that way, they can become aggressive, there are other residents in the local vicinity, a worker paying attention to this individual thinks now would be a good time to remove them from those stimuli and move them off into another area which is low stimulus where they can regroup and settle. And that looks like a timeout room, which in some configurations is a seclusion practice. Is that a restrictive practice?
Thanks. That's a really great question. And I guess the using time out or removing an individual can be seen as a restrictive practice, and quite an extreme form of restrictive practice. And what, particularly if there's language around, bad behaviour or and then removing that individual, then that can definitely be a form of seclusion. But what depends on how that the staff know that individual, and if they know that that individual does become distressed or that their behaviour changes when it's noisy and there's lots of movement and lots of activity, and the staff recognise that, then that can be a really positive thing. But the staff, if they're going to move that individual, it's about the staff spending time with that individual, that one-on-one time, and really sort of engaging with that individual to make sure that they're not getting, it's not a form of punishment, but rather more a de-escalation strategy. I think the other key thing is to make sure that that is in a behaviour support plan, so that staff are very clear that that individual is not, it's not a timeout sort of mechanism. It's, this is what this individual enjoys and really likes. They like to spend time with staff doing these, whatever those activities might be, and that way it turns into a positive behaviour intervention as opposed to more of a timeout. So it's very careful and needs to be very considered when something like that happens.
All right, really wise answer, which I'm sure people have appreciated. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our extended session, and we haven't got to the end of the questions. So what I really encourage all viewers to do is to keep an eye on our website, because we continue to provide really good content there. Lots of resources which we add to, Lauren and Megan in particular, with Melanie providing leadership to the entire area, giving you lots of new information about how to deal with the requirements relating to restrictive practices, and helping to bust the myths which seem to take flight and which you now have greater insight into, and probably, hopefully, more confidence in addressing. Thank you very much to Melanie, Lauren and Megan for the time and effort you've put into today's webinar. A quick reminder to all of those watching that we have a short survey that we would love you to complete if you go to the resources tab on your screen. Very keen to understand how you found today's webinar, but also any ideas you have for future topics that you would be pleased to watch and listen to as coming attractions. As I said at the beginning, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in coming days, so you can watch it again or watch parts of it or recommend it to others. Thank you to all of you who've participated in today's webinar. You have made it a very useful experience for us and hopefully for all of you. We look forward to further engagement with you in coming weeks and months. Bye.